He wakes up, looks at his ticket, and realizes it's now just paper. At Caracas Airport, departure boards flicker with cancellations. Airline apps suddenly warn passengers that flights may be disrupted due to elevated risk. On TV, anchors replay the same clip over and over, the President of the United States declaring that the airspace above and around Venezuela is closed, that drug traffickers and terror regimes will be hunted on land, at sea, and in the sky. Off the coast, a carrier strike group cuts through Caribbean waters. Jets lift off decks in training sorties that don't feel like just training anymore. In Washington, briefings talk about narco-terrorism and state-sponsored trafficking. In Caracas, speeches answer with economic aggression and imperialist threats to ordinary people on both sides. It sounds like a nightmare from the Cold War resurrected in real time. How did it get this bad? How do you go from being one of America's closest oil partners to being treated like a terrorist state whose airspace can simply be declared off limits? Is this really about drugs, about democracy, about oil? Or is it about something deeper, a long chain of decisions and miscalculations that neither side can unwind anymore? In this video, we're not going to pretend this started last week. We're going to rewind a full century and follow the line, step by step, from quiet oil deals to open threats of force. And as we do, ask yourself a simple question. At what point did this stop being a policy dispute and become a slow-motion divorce neither side knows how to walk back from? To answer that, we have to go back to a time when Venezuela and crisis didn't appear in the same sentence on the evening news. Back to when the story was much simpler. Back to when the United States didn't see a hostile regime in Caracas, but a business partner. 100 years earlier, no one is talking about narco-terrorism or sanctions. They're talking about oil. In the early 20th century, Venezuela is not yet a failed state meme. It's a promise. Under its soil lies some of the richest petroleum reserves on the planet, and American companies are among the first to move in, drill, and ship it north. For Washington, this isn't an enemy. It is exactly the kind of partner the Monroe Doctrine was supposed to protect, a resource-rich neighbor in a hemisphere the U.S. intends to keep free of European interference. There are tensions, yes. In 1902, European powers send warships to pressure Venezuela over unpaid debts, and the episode helps shape the U.S. claim that it, not Europe, will police the Americas. But for most of the 20th century, the basic pattern settles into something almost boring. Venezuelan oil flows north, U.S. dollars, technology, and political backing flow south. By the 1950s and 60s, as the Cold War hardens, Venezuela is seen in Washington as a relatively friendly, anti-communist democracy in a region full of coups and experiments. When U.S. presidents talk about the free world, Caracas is on the list. Oil companies sign long-term deals. Refineries in Texas and Louisiana are configured specifically for Venezuelan heavy crude. Tankers cross the Caribbean in a routine so regular nobody even thinks of it as strategic. It's just business, even when Venezuela nationalizes its oil industry in the 1970s. Creating PDVSA and taking greater control of its resources, the relationship doesn't collapse. The contracts change. The dependence doesn't. The U.S. still needs Venezuelan crude. Venezuela still needs U.S. markets, equipment, and expertise. Arguments about pricing and OPEC happen, but they happen inside a relationship both sides assume will basically continue for decades. If you told a U.S. official that within one generation, Washington would sanction Venezuela as oil company, recognize an alternative president, and talk about airspace the way it talks about war zones, they'd have laughed. So what changed? How do you get from reliable supplier to hostile regime? From quiet arguments over royalties to indictments, sanctions, and warships? In the next part of this story, we'll cross that line into the age of Hugo Chávez, failed coups, and a revolution that promised dignity at home by picking a fight abroad. Before we go there, if you new to Golden History USA and you want history that actually follows the documents and decisions, not just the memes, now is the moment to hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Most people only find channels like this once. Make sure you can find your way back. Now, let's meet the man who turned a difficult partnership into an open confrontation, and why Washington never trusted him again after 2002. He didn't start as a symbol. He started as a soldier who failed. In 1992, a young paratrooper named Hugo Chávez led a coup attempt against Venezuela's government. It failed. He went to prison, but before they locked him up, they let him speak on television for exactly 1 minute. He used it to say the words that would haunt the country for decades: Por ahora, for now, it was a confession and a promise in the same breath. Yes, we failed, for now. That for now turned into the rest of his life. After his release, Chavez reinvented himself. No longer the anonymous officer, he became the man with a story, a poor childhood, a disgust with corruption, a belief that the political class had betrayed ordinary Venezuelans. In 1998, riding a wave of anger at decades of economic crisis and discredited parties, he ran for president. He won in a landslide. From the start, he didn't talk like the presidents Washington was used to. He talked about revolution, about Simon Bolivar, about any neoliberalism at home that meant using soaring oil prices to fund social programs, food subsidies, and health missions in the barrios. Abroad, it meant hugging Fidel Castro on camera and railing against the IMF, George W. Bush, and what he called U.S. imperialism. Here's the uncomfortable part a lot of people skip for many poor Venezuelans. The first years felt like hope finally arrived. Poverty indicators fell. Polls showed real, personal loyalty to Chavez, not just to the party logo. So where does this turn from angry populism into a break with the United States? It doesn't happen in one speech. It happens in a series of confrontations and one explosive weekend in 2002. By then, Chavez had pushed through a new constitution, concentrated power in the presidency, and appointed loyalists across institutions. He also moved to assert tighter control over the state oil company, PDVSA. That was the nerve center of the country's wealth and the artery that fed U.S. refineries. Business elites, parts of the military, and segments of the middle class decided he'd gone too far. Protests mounted. On April 11, 2002, massive demonstrations turned violent. A group of officers announced that Chavez had resigned. For 2 days, a little-known businessman declared himself president. The United States moved quickly. It did not send tanks or Marines, but it did something that would burn into Chavez's memory. It welcomed his removal, blamed him for the violence, and expressed support for the interim government before he was even officially gone. 48 hours later, loyal officers reversed the coup. Chavez flew back into Caracas and returned to power. Suddenly, the narrative inside Venezuela was brutally simple. I tried to change the country. They overthrew me, and the United States applauded. Did Washington plan the coup? Documents suggest U.S. officials knew dissident officers were plotting and had funded opposition civil society groups for years. They also show no green light was formally given. It's a murky, gray zone, perfect soil for permanent suspicion. What matters for our story isn't what was whispered in every room. What matters is what millions of Venezuelans believed after 2002, that any attempt to break with the old order would be met with force, and that the world's most powerful country would cheer from the sidelines. From that point on, Chavez didn't just criticize the United States. He built his entire external identity around opposing it. He strengthened alliances with Cuba, Russia, Iran. He sent cheap oil to friendly governments in the Caribbean and Central America, buying influence and loyalty. He used every U.S. criticism as proof he was on the right track. Each insult from Washington made him stronger at home. But here is the trap nobody on either side wanted to admit. The more he needed an external enemy to justify tightening control, the more useful that enemy became. And the more he tightened control, the easier it was for Washington to paint him as just another authoritarian. Were there real abuses? Yes. Independent media were harassed. Opposition figures were jailed. Institutions that were supposed to be neutral became loyal to the presidency. The revolution wasn't just screaming at the empire. It was hardening at home. When Chavez died in 2013 and his chosen successor, Nicolas Maduro, took over, the story could have shifted. Instead, everything broke at once. Global oil prices crashed. Years of corruption and mismanagement at PDVSA caught up with the country. Production plunged. The social programs that had depended on high oil revenue suddenly had no money behind them. Inflation mutated into hyperinflation. Supermarket shelves emptied. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. Millions of Venezuelans began to leave, on foot, by bus, any way they could. At this point, you could have had one kind of crisis, internal collapse, followed by an ugly, but mostly domestic struggle over what comes next. That's not what happened. As Maduro cracked down on protests, packed the courts, and pushed ahead with elections that outside observers described as unfair, the United States and a bloc of allies chose a different approach: maximum pressure. Targeted sanctions on officials turned into wider financial sanctions. Financial sanctions turned into sectoral sanctions. Sectoral sanctions turned into direct sanctions on the lifeblood, oil. Now it wasn't just a broken state trying to feed its people. It was a broken state cut off from its main source of hard currency, facing an opposition backed openly by Washington, and an international community divided between those who saw sanctions as necessary pressure and those who saw them as collective punishment. So here's the difficult question you have to hold in your head. Whether you love or hate Maduro, how much of Venezuela's collapse is the fault of the government's own corruption and incompetence? And how much is the result of a sanctions regime that froze assets, choked exports, and scared away even those companies willing to work in that environment? Anyone who tells you it's 100% one or the other is selling you a team jersey, not an analysis. For ordinary Venezuelans, it barely matters who you blame. Their reality is this: the currency is worthless. The minimum wage buys almost nothing. If you're lucky, someone in your family is abroad, sending dollars or euros home. If you're not, you choose between food and medicine. For Washington, another question starts to dominate. If a government is authoritarian, corrupt, and driving millions of people to flee, do you try to contain it with sanctions and isolation, even if that makes the economic crisis worse? Or do you engage, risk propping it up, and hope you could extract democratic concessions in exchange? For years, U.S. policy swung toward the first option. It recognized an alternative president. It froze assets. It threatened military intervention. It tightened and then retightened sanctions whenever talks stalled. And every time it did, Maduro had an answer ready-made for the cameras. This isn't a crisis. This is a siege. Is that propaganda? Yes. Is it also partly true? Also yes. If you're still with us, do something for yourself in the comments. Write down, in one sentence, who you think carries more responsibility for the current humanitarian catastrophe, the Venezuelan state, or external pressure. Not because there's a right answer in a YouTube box, but because forcing yourself to pick will show you what you're bringing into this story. In the next part of this video, we'll look at why this didn't instead contain disaster, how a collapsing Venezuela spilled over its borders, how a territorial dispute with a smaller neighbor turned into a potential flashpoint, and how the language in Washington shifted from failed state to narco-terror regime. If you want to make sure you catch that part and the other deep dives we rate building on Latin America and U.S. power, you already know what to do. Subscribe, ring the bell, and don't rely on the algorithm to remember you exist. Now let's step out of Caracas for a moment and into the jungle borderlands, offshore oil fields, and map lines that are pulling the region and the United States into a larger confrontation. On a map, it looks like an argument over green and yellow coloring. On the ground, it's a potential war. To Venezuela's east lies Guyana, small population, big land, and for decades, not much global attention. Between them is a region called Essequibo, jungles, rivers, and, as it turned out, oil. A lot of oil. Venezuela has claimed Essequibo for more than a century, arguing that a 19th century arbitration cheated it out of territory. For most of the modern era, that dispute was basically frozen, annoying, symbolic, but not urgent. Then offshore drilling changed everything. When multinational companies started finding major oil reserves off Guyana's coast, the map suddenly turned from academic to strategic. A tiny country that had never been a player on the energy stage was now sitting on billions of barrels. Investors poured in. The United States paid attention. So did Venezuela, loudly. From Caracas, the message was simple. That oil is in waters that should be ours. That land was taken from us. We will not accept a line drawn by foreign powers. From Guyana's point of view, this wasn't an old grievance. It was a neighbor much larger than them, suddenly raising its voice, sending patrol boats and talking about referendums on annexation. So ask yourself, if you're in Washington, already dealing with a collapsed Venezuela, waves of migration and a hostile government aligned with your rivals, what do you see when that same government starts waving maps around and talking about historically stolen land, right next to huge offshore oil production where your own companies are invested? You see the risk of a second front, one part humanitarian crisis, one part potential regional conflict, and one part threat to the kind of energy flows that keep markets calm. That's the hinge where this story stops being just about sanctions and elections and starts inviting uniforms into the room. Publicly, everyone talks about peaceful solutions, international courts, dialogue. Quietly, naval deployments grow, patrols multiply, military exercises get a bit closer to each other's waters. Each move is defensive when you announce it, and provocative when your neighbor sees it. At the same time, the language in Washington shifts. Venezuela isn't just an authoritarian regime anymore. It's described as a narco-state, a hub for drugs and illegal gold, a regime whose leaders have been indicted and labeled as terrorists. The problem is no longer framed as a bad government doing bad things to its people. It becomes a criminal organization with a flag. Once you adopt that lens, a different toolbox comes out. Sanctions feel like the slow option. Military assets stop being symbolic and start being on the table. Maritime strikes on boats suspected of trafficking drugs aren't framed as shots at a state. They're packaged as law enforcement with bigger missiles. From Caracas, it looked like something else entirely. The superpower that once bought your oil failed to topple you with sanctions and is now testing what it can hit without saying the word war. From Washington, the argument is clinical. We're hitting traffickers. We're defending the region. We're sending a message. From the point of view of anyone caught on a boat or living in a coastal town, the distinction doesn't really matter. And this is where the story can go wrong very fast. Not with a big grand decision, not a formal declaration, not a vote in Congress, not a speech beginning my fellow Americans. It can go wrong with a misidentification. One mistaken radar blip. One patrol firing a warning shot that gets misread. One pilot misjudging the risk and flying a little too close. Venezuela, under pressure, cannot afford to look weak. The United States, after branding a regime as criminal and dangerous for years, cannot easily climb back down without looking inconsistent or soft. That's not a good combination. So picture this. A U.S. drone hits what it believes is a trafficker's vessel, operating with state protection. Venezuela says it was a civilian boat. A Venezuelan missile battery locks onto an American aircraft by accident or as a warning. Nobody fires. This time. How many this time moments do you get before one of them goes the wrong way? Here is the psychological trap for you as a viewer. It is very easy to watch this and instinctively pick a side. To say, Maduro is a dictator, so whatever happens is his fault. Or, the U.S. is a bully, so anything it does is aggression. It's harder and more uncomfortable to sit with two truths at once. Venezuela's people are suffering under a corrupt, authoritarian system that has destroyed their economy and institutions. And the way the United States chooses to confront that system can make things worse. Not only for Venezuelans, but for an entire region and maybe for its own long-term interests. So what are the options? One path is what you're seeing now: escalating sanctions, escalating rhetoric, escalating military presence. Another path would require something neither side has shown much appetite for: serious, slow, boring diplomacy, real guarantees for elections, real relief for a population that didn't choose. This standoff, that doesn't make for dramatic headlines, but it might be the only path that doesn't lead to more bodies in the Caribbean. More people walking across borders with plastic bags as suitcases. And yet another wound in a region that already has too many. If you've watched this far, here is the uncomfortable question only you can answer. When you hear a leader talk about surgical strikes, maximum pressure, or historic claims, what part of you lights up first? The part that wants justice, or the part that wants to see someone punished? Because those are not always the same thing. And if we don't learn to tell the difference, stories like this will keep ending the same way, with ordinary people paying the price for other people as grand strategies. We started this video with one man staring at a useless plane ticket in Caracas. If things go the wrong way, the next image might not be canceled flights. It could be burning fuel on a runway, closed borders, another generation growing up with the idea that the only choices are submission or exile. If you don't want history reduced to slogans and propaganda, if you want to keep tracing these lines from how did we get here to what happens next, this is the moment to hit subscribe to Golden History USA, tap the bell, and tell the algorithm this kind of content matters more than another outrage clip. And in the comments, don't just write who you blame. Write what you think would actually de-escalate this. Not the satisfying answer, the effective one. Because in the end, power will do what it does. The only thing we can control is how clearly we see it while it happens.